Okay there, what's up YouTube? This is J Manti, and today I have a video on rare warships of the Belgian Navy of World War I and World War II. Now, one of the least talked about factions or least mentioned factions of the First and Second World War is the Belgian Navy. Now, during World War I and World War II, the Belgian Navy consisted of a small number of warships that either patrolled the Belgian coast or the Belgian territories in Africa, or colonial territories in Africa. So let's go over some of the Belgian warships of World War I and II, and the Belgian warships of the Belgian fleet of the Belgian Congo and other Belgian territories at the time that were in Belgian control or under Belgium's control during the First and Second World War. First, let's talk about Belgian warships of World War I. During World War I, the Belgian Navy was very small, and it was mostly used as either a small coastal defense force or as fishery protection vessels. Now, the Belgian Navy in World War I was renamed twice. The original name of the Belgian Navy was the Marine Royale, or Marine d'Etat, as it's known in French, but later on in 1917, following Germany's annexation of Belgium during the Schiffen Plan, or the Schiffen Offensive of 1914, Belgium had to rename its navy while it was under French control, as the remaining Belgian ships were later transferred to the French Navy, and France later provided Belgium with some of its own warships. And during that time period, the Belgian Navy was renamed the Crops of Destroyers and Sailors, for short. So let's go over some of these warships. And the first ship on the list is the WWI, also known in English as the City of Antwerp. Now, the City of Antwerp was a Belgian aviso, or coastal patrol vessel, that was constructed originally between 1885 and 1886. She had a displacement of 414 tons. Her main armament was very strange, as she was fitted with a variety of guns from a variety of different countries. Her main armament was one 90mm French-made Debang Model 1877 field gun modified for naval use. She also was fitted with two 75mm French Hotchkiss guns and one 57mm Hotchkiss 6-pounder quick-firing gun. He also had a 54mm German or Dutch gun and one or two 37mm Hotchkiss revolving guns. I also heard that one of her 57mm guns was a Portuguese gun, actually. Her speed was 11 knots, and she had a crew of 85. Her armor thickness was basically non-existent, as she was originally designed as a unarmored yacht, but was later converted into an aviso for Belgium. She was the largest warship in the Belgian Navy during the German invasion of Belgium in 1914. Later on, after the fall of Belgium in 1914, the Ville d'Anvers was later transferred to the UK, where she remained part of the Belgian Navy in exile, or the Belgian European Fleet in exile, along with several merchant vessels. In 1918, following the end of World War I, she returned to Belgian service again and was rearmed a second time, only to be decommissioned and sold for scrap in the post-war year of 1925. So this ship had a pretty long service history, but overall, she really didn't see any combat. During the German invasion of Belgium, all of the Belgian warships were either captured, and a small number of ships that managed to escape to the UK were mostly merchant vessels. And this ship, the Ville d'Anvers, or the City of Antwerp, was one of the few warships to manage to escape to the UK, and she was also the largest warship in the Belgian Navy. The next Belgian warship on the list is the Blankenberger, which was originally a tugboat/gunboat that was commissioned in the early 1900s. Her displacement was just a mere 10 to 20 tons. Her main armament was one 37mm Hotchkiss Model 1885 field gun modified for naval use, and she was also fitted with one 7.65mm machine gun. Her armor thickness was also non-existent, as she was converted from a civilian tugboat, and she had a speed of just 6 to 8 knots and a crew of between 4 and 10. The Blankenberger was originally a civilian yacht, but when Germany invaded Belgium in 1914, she was quickly converted into a improvised gunboat, or armed yacht as it was known, or armed tug. Later on, Germany annexed Belgium, and the ship later fled to France, and she was actually used by the French Navy, by the Belgian Navy in exile based in France. Later on, the area where she was originally stationed was recaptured by the French between 1917 and 1918, and she re-entered Belgian territory and was later recommissioned into the Belgian Navy. But after World War I, she was decommissioned and her fate is unknown. She was most likely deconverted into a civilian vessel, back into a civilian vessel, and was most likely scrapped sometime between the 1920s and the 1930s. But it is unknown, as the Belgians didn't really write any history on this ship after World War I. So she is pretty much a mystery in terms of what happened to her after the war. Now, let's talk about some of the Belgian European river gunboats. Now, during World War I and before World War I, the Belgian Navy actually had a small fleet of river patrol boats that actually patrolled Belgian rivers, both within Belgium and on the Belgian-Dutch border, on the border between Belgium and the Netherlands. And so here are some of the gunboats of the rare Belgian European river flotilla. The first gunboat on the list is the Argos, or the Argos. The Argos was a Belgian gunboat constructed in 1900. She had a displacement of 120 tons. Her main armament was two 37mm Hotchkiss model 1910 guns, but originally they were Hotchkiss model 1885 guns, and she was also fitted with one 7.65mm Belgian Hotchkiss machine gun, or Maxim Belgian machine gun, or Belgian Maxim machine gun. Her armor thickness is largely unknown, and her speed was 11 knots, and she had a crew of 21. Le Argus served as a police gunboat. She was used to patrol the Scheldt River, or the Scheldt River, as one of the many Belgian gunboats produced in the years before World War I. In 1914, when the German army invaded Belgium, she later fled to neutral Holland, where she was interned by the Holland government. Later on, after World War I, she went back to Belgium and later served in the Belgian Navy up until 1935. In 1935, she was later decommissioned and disarmed, but in 1940, she was captured by Germany again during the second German invasion of Belgium in 1940. She was later repaired and served in the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, and in 1945, she was later found in the German city of Hamburg, where she was repaired and returned to Antwerp again. She was later scrapped during the post-Second World War era, thus ending the history of the Belgian gunboat Le Argus, or the Argus. The next gunboat on the list is the Le Minerva, or the Minerva, and the Minerva was a gunboat constructed in 1898. She had a displacement of 220 tons. Her main armament was two 57mm Maxim Nordenfeldt model 1910 guns, which were later installed in 1910. Her secondary armament was one 7.65mm machine gun, and she had a speed of 11 knots and a crew of 21. The ship had virtually no armor. Now, Le Minerva, just like the previous ship, Le Argus, also served in the Scheldt River, or the Scheldt River, along with other Belgian gunboats, and when World War I began in 1914, she later fled to neutral Holland, where she was interned by the Holland government and stayed there until the end of the war on November the 11th, 1918. After World War I, she was recommissioned into the Belgian River Flotilla again and served until 1927. In 1927, she was eventually decommissioned, and her fate after 1927 is largely unknown. The next Belgian gunboat on the list is the Le Hirondelle from 1900. The Le Hirondelle was another river gunboat that was used to patrol the Scheldt River between Belgium and Holland. Her displacement was 120 tons, and her main armament was one 57mm Nordenfeldt Maxim model 1910 gun, or model 1904 gun. Later on, in 1910, she was fitted with two 37mm Hotchkiss Model 1910 field guns converted for naval use. Her armor thickness is unknown, and she had a speed of 11 knots and a crew of 21. And just like her sister ships, Lee Argos and Lee Minerva, she also fled to neutral Holland when hostilities began in 1914, and she was interned by the Hollandian government until 1918. After World War I, her fate is also unknown, as she was most likely sold for scrap sometime in the 1920s or 30s, thus ending the history of this short-lived gunboat, the Lee Harndale, from 1900. The next Belgian warships or gunboats were gunboats of the Police de la Rade, of class of cannoneer or gunboats that were used to patrol the Scheldt River between Belgium and Holland. These ships were the Police de la Rade 1 and Police de la Rade 2. The ships had a displacement of 88 tons, and their main armament consisted of two 57mm Model 1910 guns or Model 1895 guns and later Model 1910 guns. The ships had a armor thickness that is largely unknown, and their speeds were 9 knots, and they had a crew of 21. Now, these were actually two separate warships. The first one was the Police de la Rade 1, which was constructed in 1895, and the Police de la Rade 2, which was constructed later on in 1898. And these ships also served in the Belgian River Navy on the border between Belgium and Holland, and they too were later interned in Holland when Belgium was annexed by Germany in 1914. Later on, these two ships were returned to Belgium in 1919, and they were later sold for scrap in 1932. So these ships really didn't serve, they served for a very long time, over 40 years combined, but their service history in World War I was basically zero. And the last of the Belgian river warships of the First World War, at least in Europe, was the Police de la Rade number 3, which was constructed in 1914, just before the war began. Now, she had a displacement of 122 tons. Her main armament was two 57mm Hotchkiss Model 1910 guns, and she had a speed of 16.7 knots or 30 kilometers per hour, and she had a crew of 21. And she was constructed in 1909. In 1914, when Germany invaded Belgium, she too later fled to neutral Holland, where she was interned by the Holland government. Later on, in 1918, after the war, she was returned to Belgium, and in 1919, she served as a patrol boat on the Rhine River. When Germany invaded Belgium again in 1940, she was captured by the German army during the second invasion of Belgium, and was later used by the German occupation army until May the 18th, 1944, where she was eventually towed out to sea and scuttled by the occupying German forces. And that basically ends her service in World War I and World War II. She was actually salvaged later on in the later 40s and actually served as a tugboat up until 1954, and she was eventually decommissioned for the final time, thus ending the history of the Police de la Rade number 3, the last Belgian gunboat constructed just before the beginning of World War I. And the final Belgian warship to be used by the Belgian European forces in World War I was the Henriette. The Henriette was an armed yacht or gunboat or improvised gunboat or auxiliary gunboat that was constructed sometime between the 1880s and 1890s. She had a displacement of about 100 tons, and she had a main armament of one 37mm Hotchkiss Model 1885 gun, and she had a secondary armament of one 7.65mm Belgian version of the Maxim machine gun. Her armor thickness was none, as she was originally constructed as a civilian yacht, and she had a speed of 6 to 8 knots and a crew of between 4 and 16. Now, the Henriette was not commissioned until 1918. During the final year of the war, when the French started winning against the Germans, the Belgians confiscated one of the few yachts that were stationed in France, and that was the Henriette. He was converted into an auxiliary gunboat and pressed into service with the Belgian Navy and exiled in France. Later on, she was used during the Calais offensive in 1918. But during this offensive, she was actually disarmed and basically disused at this point. She was basically disarmed with most of her weapons, but sadly later on, during the same time period, her sails caught fire and she eventually sank at her moorings on the 7th of September 1918, just a few months before the end of World War I. So that basically ends the service of the Henriette. She was basically the last warship to be used by the Belgian Navy just before the end of the war, but she also had the shortest service length of just a few months before she eventually sank from a fire. Her 37mm gun was stripped off, and she probably only had her machine gun left when she caught fire and sank in the city of Calais, in the western basin of the region of Calais in France. So that basically ends the history of the Belgian European fleet in World War I. So let's talk about the Belgian fleet based in Africa in the Belgian colonies during the same conflict of World War I. Now we're moving on to the Africa campaign of the First World War, and we're going to be going over the Belgian Navy of the Belgian Congo and the Belgian Navy of the Belgian Congo. And the first vessel on the list is the Alexander de Camoun. The Alexander de Camoun was a former British steamer built in 1899. She was later transferred to the Belgian Congo during the First World War in 1914, and she was later converted into an auxiliary gunboat for the Belgian Navy based in the state of Katanga, or Katanga region in the Belgian Congo. Her displacement was 30 tons, and she had a main armament of two 76mm, 7.7 centimeter, 65 caliber, 3-inch main guns. Her armor was non-existent. Her speed was a mere 6 knots, and she had a crew of between 15 and 20. Now, the Alexander de Camoun was later used during the Battle of Lake Tanganyika in 1915. Now, this was actually the largest naval battle to occur in Central Africa, or the Belgian Congo, during the First World War. In fact, the Battle of Lake Tanganyika actually happened in multiple countries, as Lake Tanganyika actually borders 5 separate countries, as it is the largest lake in Africa. This warship, the Alexander de Camoun, was the largest Belgian warship on Lake Tanganyika during that time period. Now, during the Battle of Lake Tanganyika between 1915 and 1916, the combined Belgian and British forces attempted to defeat, or managed to defeat, the slightly larger but smaller German fleet led by the German auxiliary gunboat, the Graf von Gotsen, which was a German gunboat with a 13,500-ton displacement, making her the largest warship on Lake Tanganyika. The Graf von Gotsen also had 2 escort ships, the smaller gunboat, the Hedwig von Weissman, and the customs cruiser WWI, which was really just a very small gunboat. During the Battle of Lake Tanganyika, the WWI was captured by the British and Belgian forces and later renamed HMS Kagani, while the Hedwig von Weissman was later sunk in combat. Later on, towards the end of the battle, the Graf von Gotsen herself was scuttled and abandoned by her crew, and later the German forces abandoned Lake Tanganyika as a whole. Now, during the entire battle, the Alexander de Camoun was pretty much the largest warship in the Belgian Navy in Africa at the time. So in a way, she was kind of the flagship. And that's basically it. After World War I, she was decommissioned and disarmed and later put back into service as a civilian vessel, and her fate after World War I is basically unknown, as there's no history of her post-1916. And that basically ends it for the largest Belgian warship to be used in Africa during the First World War. Another warship used by the Belgian Navy in Africa was the SS Mosselback, also known as the SS 10 Tons. She was a tiny lake gunboat constructed in 1915. Her displacement was 10 tons, and she had a main armament of one 57mm Nordenfeldt Model 1887 gun, which was later replaced by a 47mm French Hotchkiss 3-pounder gun. She also was fitted with one or two 7.65mm machine guns. Her speed was 6.5 knots, and she had a crew of just 4 to 6. Now, this was one of the tiniest warships of the Belgian Navy, and she was used to patrol the ports in the region of Leopoldville in the Belgian Congo. Now, during World War I, she served in this capacity. The small gunboat Mosselback also took part in the Battle of Lake Tanganyika starting on December the 26th, 1915, along with the British torpedo boats HMS Mimi and Tutu and the actual flagship of the Belgian Navy. During the Battle of Lake Tanganyika, the Belgian torpedo boat Netta. During this battle, she, along with Mimi, Tutu, and Netta, actually managed to sink the German gunboat Hedwig von Weissmann and capture the smaller gunboat Kagani, or Waimi, which was later renamed Kagani. The next gunboat on the list is the torpedo gunboat Netta from 1915, also known in French as the Canonnière Netta. She was a torpedo boat constructed in 1915 specifically for the Belgian fleet based on Lake Tanganyika. Her displacement was 16 tons, and she had a main armament of one 57mm Maxim Nordenfeldt gun, one 37mm Hotchkiss revolving gun, and two 7.65mm Maxim machine guns. The second heaviestly armed warship in the Belgian Lake Tanganyika fleet. Her speed was 19 knots, and she had a crew of between 9 and 10. Now, during the Battle of Lake Tanganyika, Netta actually led these faster warships, the Mosselback and the British torpedo boats HMS Mimi and HMS Tutu, as they engaged the German forces on Lake Tanganyika. After the Battle of Lake Tanganyika, eventually, the Belgian and British forces managed to capture the entirety of the Lake Tanganyika region from German forces, and that basically ends the service history of Netta, at least during World War I. After the battle at the end of 1916, she, along with other vessels, went back to their original duties as patrol boats for the Belgian colonial navy based in the Congo. And that's basically it. Her post-war history is largely unknown, but she was most likely sold for scrap in the 1920s and 30s, like most other warships from this era being used by the Belgian Navy. And finally, the last Belgian gunboat of the Belgian colonial fleet of World War I was the SS Paul Röntgen. The Paul Röntgen, or Canonnière Röntgen, was a small gunboat that was constructed in 1915. Her displacement was a mere 20 tons. Her main armament was one 37mm Hotchkiss revolving gun, and she was also fitted with one or two 7.65mm Maxim machine guns. Her armor thickness was none, and her speed was 16.7 knots, and she had a crew of between 5 and 10. Commissioned on November the 26th, 1915, she would serve as the only gunboat of the Belgian Navy on Lake Kivu. Lake Kivu is located in the eastern Congo region, and she would pretty much serve in this capacity during World War I. Now, there actually was a tiny skirmish around Lake Kivu, but it is unknown if the Paul Röntgen was actually involved in that skirmish, as it was mostly a land battle. But she did serve in the Belgian Navy during World War I and was one of the rarer gunboats that never really gets mentioned in any history books of the Belgian Navy during the First World War, the SS Paul Röntgen. And that basically ends it for the Belgian Navy of the First World War. Now, during the First World War, the Belgian Navy really didn't do much, at least when it came to the Belgian Navy in Europe. Now, in Africa, the Belgian Navy assisted the British in their victory over the German forces in Central Africa, especially during the Battle of Lake Tanganyika between late 1915 and early 1916. Okay, now let's talk about some of the Belgian warships of the Second World War. During World War II, the Belgian Navy was also pretty small, just like its World War I counterpart. And during the years before World War II, the Belgian Navy was largely used as a fisheries protection unit rather than a standard issued navy, like for example the French or Dutch Navy. The Belgian Navy did have some interesting warships that were used during the interwar years and during the invasion of Belgium in 1940. So the first ship on the list is the Belgian Sloopzhenya. From 1915, the Xenia was originally a British Flower-class trawler, armed trawler, known as HMS Xenia, and she was constructed in 1915 originally during the First World War, but later on in 1920 she was sold to Belgium. In Belgian service, she was refitted with newer weapons. Her main armament consisted of two 120mm 40 caliber QF Mark I naval guns. She was also fitted with two 47mm 40 caliber Hotchkiss 3-pounder guns, and she was also fitted with two depth charge racks that could carry upwards to 40 depth charges. Her armor thickness was non-existent, as these Flower-class sloops were meant to be simple patrol boats. Her speed was 16.5 knots, and she had a crew of 90. Now, during the 1920s and 30s, the Xenia served as a basic patrol boat or sloop of war for the Belgian Navy, and just before World War II, she was used as a fisheries protection vessel. Now, when Germany invaded Belgium in 1940, the Belgian Navy was ordered to Great Britain, but many of the ships were captured by the Germans, and that included the Xenia. After being captured by the Germans, the Xenia was renamed the KMS Barbara, and she was stationed in the German-occupied city of Antwerp from 1941 until the end of the war. During this time period, she was upgraded using German weapons, and she was given three 105mm 42 caliber SK deck guns, or SK model 1932 deck guns. She was also given four 37mm 80 caliber single shot model 1930 autocannons. She was also fitted with three 20mm Italian-made autocannons, Breda model 1931/1938 autocannons, and in German service she was used to patrol the occupied Belgian coast. Now, after World War II, the Xenia was returned to Belgium, and she was reclassified as a frigate, serving in the post-war Belgian Navy up until 1952. In 1952, she was finally decommissioned and sold for scrap, thus ending the history of the heaviest warship in the Belgian Navy during the Second World War, the Xenia. The next class of Belgian warship of the Second World War are the A4 class of armed trawlers. Now, these trawlers were actually constructed for the Royal Navy in 1917 towards the end of World War I, and these ships consisted of the A4, A5, and A6. These ships had a displacement of 339 tons. They had a main armament of one 47mm Hotchkiss 3-pounder gun and two 7.65mm Belgian version of the Vickers machine gun. Their armor thickness was unknown, and they had a speed of 10 knots or 19 kilometers per hour or 12 miles per hour and a crew of 27. These ships were originally constructed for the Royal Navy in World War I, but in 1919 they were later sold to Belgium. Now in Belgian service, they would serve as fisheries protection vessels up until the start of World War II. In 1939, they were reclassified as coastal patrol boats, but in 1940, when Germany invaded, these ships were actually told to surrender themselves to Spain. And these ships fled to neutral Spain, where they were interred by the Spanish Navy from 1940 until the end of the war in 1945. After 1945, these vessels would serve as pilot vessels until 1946-1947, where they too were finally decommissioned and either sold for scrap or disarmed and reused as civilian vessels, thus ending the history of the Belgian A4 class of coastal patrol boats or armed trawlers. Now, during World War II, the Belgian Navy also had several coastal torpedo boats, and these boats were actually taken from Germany at the end of World War I, reissued to the Belgian Navy. And the first torpedo boat for the Belgian Navy of the Second World War is the torpedo boat Westdiep, also known originally as the German coastal torpedo boat A9. Now, the Westdiep was actually part of the 150-ton A1 class of coastal torpedo boats that were constructed for the World War I era German Navy. She had a displacement of 150 tons. Her main armament was one 52mm, 5.2 centimeter Nordenfeldt L35 35 caliber main gun. Her secondary armament was two 450mm torpedo tubes, and she had a speed of 19 knots or 25.9 kilometers per hour, and she had a crew of 29. Now, this ship was actually sold as part of a package by the Allies, consisting of the A1 class of captured German coastal torpedo boats, and this was the A1 through 9 series of boats. So there were actually 9 boats originally, but during the 1920s and 30s, 8 of the 9 boats were sold for scrap, leaving the Westdiep as the last survivor. And during the German invasion of Belgium in 1940, the Westdiep was actually captured while stationed in the city of Antwerp. After her capture by the Germans, she was incorporated into the German Kriegsmarine as the German torpedo boat Reher, and then she later served in this capacity until Germany was finally defeated in 1945. In 1945, she was returned to the Belgian Navy and later served in the post-war Navy up until 1948, where she was finally decommissioned and sold for scrap, thus ending the history of the Belgian torpedo boat Westdiep, formerly known as the German torpedo boat A9. A second torpedo boat was used by the Belgian Navy at the beginning of World War II, and that ship was known as the WWI. The WWI, which was originally known in World War I as the German torpedo boat A24, and she was part of the A22 class of coastal torpedo boats constructed for the World War I era German Navy. Her displacement was 250 tons. Her main armament was two 88mm, 8.8 centimeter L30 30 caliber main guns, and she had one 450mm torpedo tube. Her speed was 25 knots or 30.9 kilometers per hour, and she also had a crew of 29. She was sold to the Belgian Navy in 1920 as part of a deal with the Allies, consisting of 6 torpedo boats from the A22 class, the A22, A23 through A29. And these ships served in the Belgian Navy, but most of them were scrapped during the interwar years. And when Belgium was invaded in 1940, only the A24, renamed WWI, was still in service. Just like the previous torpedo boat Westdiep, she was also captured in the city of Antwerp by German troops in 1940. But unlike the Westdiep, WWI was not used by the German Kriegsmarine during the Second World War, as the Germans viewed her as being in poor shape. And she was later broken up by the Kriegsmarine in 1943. So unlike Westdiep, she was not used by the German occupation forces, and she ended up being scrapped, thus ending the history of the Belgian torpedo boat WWI, formerly known as the German torpedo boat A24. And finally, and the next warship is actually my favorite Belgian warship designed during the years before and during World War II, and that is the Belgian frigate Artevelde from 1939-1940. Now, the Artevelde was actually an experimental frigate designed for the Belgian Navy. She had a displacement of 1,640 tons. Her main armament was 4 102mm Hotchkiss guns, and she was also fitted with 2 20mm Hotchkiss anti-aircraft guns. Her armor thickness is unknown, and she had a speed of 28.5 knots, or 30.9 kilometers per hour, and a crew of 120. Now, the Artevelde was actually meant to be a class of fisheries protection vessels that were designed to replace all of the previous vessels I mentioned. Now, most of the Belgian warships at the beginning of World War II were just leftover British and German vessels from World War I, and the Artevelde was meant to be the first of a class of warships. But unfortunately, during the German invasion of 1940, she was only 70 to 80% complete, and she still needed about 2 weeks worth of construction before she was completed. So when the Germans invaded in 1940, she was actually captured while she was still under construction in Antwerp. And the Artevelde was actually captured by the invading German army while she was still on the stocks. She needed about 2 more weeks of construction before she was completed, and she was about 80% complete when the Germans captured her in 1940. Now, after being captured by the Germans, she was actually completed for the Kriegsmarine, and she was renamed the German patrol boat K4, also known as Lorelei. And Lorelei served in the Kriegsmarine off the coast of Belgium from 1940 until 1945. During this time period, she was actually upgraded with 2 105mm guns and 1 40mm Bofors captured from British forces, and she was also given a depth charge rack capable of carrying upwards to 30 depth charges, and a mineling rack capable of carrying upwards to 64 naval mines. She was used to mine the coast of the Netherlands during the Second World War. Ultimately, she was captured by the Allied forces during the liberation of Belgium and the Netherlands in 1945. After World War II, she was returned back to Belgium, but by this time she was completely worn out and had been damaged during the war. And as a result, she was converted into a barracks and training ship and served from 1951 until she was eventually scrapped in 1954, thus ending the history of the Artevelde, one of my favorite Belgian warships designed during the early stages of World War II. Which brings me to the last vessel on the list, and that is the Belgian warship, the HMS Cornet, originally known in 1940 as the Lodz boat P-16. The P-16 was originally a pilot vessel constructed in 1929 for the Belgian Coast Guard, but during the German invasion, or during the build-up to the German invasion of Belgium between 1939 and 1940, she was quickly converted into a patrol boat for the Belgian Navy, and she had a displacement of 451 tons. Her main armament was 3 47mm Hotchkiss guns, and she was also fitted with 10 37mm Hotchkiss revolving guns from the First World War. Her armor thickness was none, as she was a pilot vessel, and she had a speed of 13 knots, and she had a crew of 364. Now, the Lodz boat P-16, later renamed HMS Cornet, was one of the few, if not the only, heavy warship from the Belgian Navy to escape to the UK during the German invasion. Afterwards, she was renamed HMS Cornet and later served as HMS Cornet, and later served alongside the British fleet, along with a few other British destroyers and gunboats that were given to the Belgian Navy in exile. After World War II, she was disarmed and put back into service in her original configuration as a pilot vessel, and was scrapped sometime in the 1950s or 60s. And that basically ends the history of this vessel. The next warship on the list is the Belgian minesweeper Jacqueline, originally known as the Canadian minesweeper TR-15 from 1918. The Jacqueline was originally a Canadian minesweeper constructed at the end of World War I, and her original name was HMS Castle. Now, in 1918, at the end of World War I, she was sold to Belgium, and she later served in the Belgian Navy as a minesweeper. Her displacement was 547 tons. Her main armament was one 47mm Hotchkiss 3-pounder 40 caliber main gun, and she was also fitted with at least 1 or 2 machine guns for minesweeping operations. Now, in 1940, the Jacqueline was one of the many ships captured by the Germans, but she was captured in the Belgian city of Ostend by German troops and was later used as a minesweeper for the German Kriegsmarine, operating out of Belgium. Later on, she was recaptured by the Allies in 1945, and her fate after World War II was largely unknown. But that basically ends the history of the TR-15 Jacqueline, a minesweeper from 1918 originally. And finally, the Belgian Navy also had 2 classes of limited production / experimental motor patrol boats. And the first of those is the Toll Watch 1. Now, the Toll Watch 1 was an experimental harbor patrol vessel constructed in 1929. Her displacement is not listed, but she seems to weigh at least 50 to 100 tons or less. Her speed was 15 knots, and her armament is unknown, but I would assume it to be either 1 or 2 30 caliber machine guns or 7.65mm Belgian Vickers machine guns. And her crew is also unknown. Now, when the Germans invaded in 1940, she later fled to neutral Holland on the 15th of May 1940. And her fate afterwards is pretty much unknown. It is unknown if she was ever returned back to Belgium, but this vessel is pretty strange. It is a rare experimental motor patrol boat. But even its design is strange. It doesn't look like the standard torpedo boat or motor torpedo boat from the era. But yes, the Toll Watch 1 was one of the experimental vessels actually used by the Belgian Navy in World War II. And the final class of Belgian torpedo boat or motor patrol boat, or the R1 class of motor torpedo boat or motor patrol boat from 1939/1940. Now, these were the last motor patrol boats constructed by the Belgian Navy just before World War II. They had a displacement of about 11 to 40 tons. Their main armament was one 7mm machine gun or 7.65mm machine gun, and they had a speed of 27 knots. Crew capacity is unknown, but it seems to be at least 11 crewmen aboard these patrol boats. And there were 2 of these vessels, the R1 and R2. They also served during the German invasion of Belgium in 1940. It seems as if these 2 vessels might have escaped to the UK, but there's not much history on them. Now, they are mentioned by the British Royal Air Force, so I'm assuming they did escape to the UK, but their service after 1940 isn't well documented. And that basically ends the history of the Belgian Navy in World War I and World War II. If I had to pick my favorite vessels from this list, I would say the World War I era Belgian torpedo boat Netta, and the World War II era frigate Artevelde from 1939/1940. Those are my 2 favorite vessels from these 2 eras of the Belgian Navy. But what are yours? Please tell me in the comment section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.